The dust billowed around Madeline Adams like a suffocating shroud as she watched the stagecoach disappear into the horizon, abandoning her in the small frontier town of Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. Her former fiancé, had decided she wasn't worth taking to California after all, leaving her with nothing but a small valise of belongings and a broken heart in a town where she knew no one. "Miss, you cannot stand in the middle of the street all day," a gruff voice called out. "You're spooking the horses." Madeline turned to face a tall man atop a chestnut stallion. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the impatience in his eyes. The locals were already staring, whispering behind their hands as they watched the spectacle of an abandoned woman. I have nowhere to go," she admitted, hating how weak her voice sounded. The man sighed heavily, glancing around the dusty main street before looking back at her. "That ain't my problem, miss. Just get out of the road before you get yourself trampled." Madeline lifted her chin, summoning what dignity she had left. "I understand, sir. I would hate to inconvenience you further." As she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her worn boot caught on a loose board, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Her valise flew open, scattering her meager belongings across the dusty ground. Tears pricked at her eyes as she scrambled to collect her things before the wind carried them away. The horseman dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his large frame, and to her surprise, he knelt down beside her. "Here now," he said, his voice softer than before as he picked up a small book and handed it to her. "That's no way for a lady to be treated." His eyes, she noticed now, were a startling blue against his sun-weathered skin. He collected her hairbrush and a small tin of hairpins, placing them carefully back in the valise. "Thank you," she whispered, mortified by the public display. "Jacob O'Malley," he said, offering his name along with a handkerchief to wipe the dust from her face. "And you are Madeline Adams," she replied, accepting the handkerchief gratefully. "Well, Miss Adams," he said, helping her to her feet, "seems to me you're in need of some assistance." He brushed the dust from her sleeve with a gentle hand. "You're a bit precious for a town like this, I reckon." Her cheeks burned at the word, precious, like a delicate, useless trinket. It was what Henry had called her just before he'd left her behind, claiming she was too refined, too precious for the rugged life that awaited them, too much of a burden. "I am not precious, Mr. O'Malley," she said firmly, handing back his handkerchief. "I am simply in a difficult situation. One I intend to remedy immediately." Jacob's eyebrows rose slightly at her tone, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough," he said, tipping his hat. "The boarding house is 2 streets over. Mrs. Whittaker might have a room, and the Silver Dollar Saloon is hiring girls to serve drinks nothing untoward," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just honest work for those willing." Madeline nodded, gathering her composure along with her valise. "Thank you for the information, Mr. O'Malley. Miss Adams," he called as she turned to leave, "this town, it ain't kind to those without friends. If you need anything, I'm usually at the livery stable on the north end of town." She gave him a small smile. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll manage." As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back, and for the first time since the stagecoach had pulled away, Madeline felt something other than despair, a small, flickering flame of determination. Mrs. Whittaker did indeed have a room, though the price was steep for Madeline's limited funds. The older woman eyed her suspiciously, but relented when Madeline paid 2 weeks in advance, leaving her with barely enough money for food. "No gentlemen callers, no noise after 9, and rents due promptly every fortnight," Mrs. Whittaker rattled off, leading her to a small attic room with a sloped ceiling and a narrow bed. "Yes, madam," Madeline replied, setting her valise on the threadbare quilt. "I don't suppose you know of any respectable work available in town," Mrs. Whittaker's lips pursed. "Not much for a lady like yourself. The general store sometimes needs help and the schoolteacher is getting on in years, but most women here are either married or—" She trailed off meaningfully. "I understand," Madeline said, though her heart sank. Thank you. That evening, after a meager supper of bread and cheese in her room, Madeline sat by the small window overlooking the main street. Copper Creek was coming alive with the night, lamps being lit in windows and the distant sounds of piano music drifting from the saloon. This wasn't how her life was supposed to unfold. By now, she should have been in California, preparing for her wedding to Henry. Instead, she was alone in a strange town with limited options and dwindling funds. But she was not without skills. Back in Boston, she had worked as a seamstress before meeting Henry, and her fingers were nimble with a needle. Perhaps there was work to be found for someone with her talents. The next morning, Madeline dressed in her most respectable dress, a navy blue cotton with minimal adornment, and set out to find employment. The general store had no positions available, nor did the small dress shop run by a sour-faced woman who looked Madeline up and down as if assessing a competitor rather than a potential employee. By midday, her feet ached and her spirit was flagging. She paused outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, considering Jacob O'Malley's words about them hiring. The idea of serving drinks to rowdy cowboys made her stomach tighten, but the prospect of starving was far worse. Before she could make up her mind, a commotion down the street caught her attention. A wagon had overturned and sacks of flour were spilling onto the ground. Without thinking, Madeline hurried to help, joining the small crowd that had gathered. "Keep those horses steady." A familiar voice commanded, and Madeline looked up to see Jacob O'Malley taking charge of the situation. He was helping the driver, an elderly man who appeared shaken but unhurt. "Miss Adams," Jacob said, spotting her in the crowd. "Would you mind taking Mr. Peterson over to Doc Mitchell's office, just down the street there? I'll handle this mess." Grateful for a purpose, Madeline took the old man's arm and guided him toward the doctor's office. Mr. Peterson thanked her profusely, explaining that he was the town baker and that the lost flour represented a significant financial blow. "I don't know how I'll fill my orders now," he lamented as the doctor checked him for injuries. "Perhaps I could help," Madeline offered. "I'm looking for work, and while I'm not a baker, I'm a quick learner." Mr. Peterson eyed her thoughtfully. "Can you start tomorrow morning?" 5 o'clock sharp, hope bloomed in her chest. "Yes, sir, I'll be there." When she emerged from the doctor's office, Jacob was waiting, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Peterson going to be all right?" "Yes, just a few bruises," she replied. "He's offered me a position at his bakery." Jacob's face broke into a smile that transformed his rugged features. "Well now, that's good news. Old Peterson makes the best sourdough this side of the Mississippi." "I'm grateful for the opportunity," Madeline said, suddenly aware of how the afternoon sun brought out gold flecks in Jacob's blue eyes. She cleared her throat. "And thank you for suggesting I help him." "Weren't nothing," Jacob said, placing his hat back on his head. "Though I reckon this means we won't be seeing you serving drinks at the Silver Dollar." "No, I suppose not," she agreed, relieved. Jacob nodded, seemingly pleased by this development. "Peterson's Bakery opens early. If you'd like, I could walk you there tomorrow morning." Streets aren't always safe for a lady before dawn. Madeline hesitated, unused to accepting help from strangers, especially men, but there was something about Jacob O'Malley that made her want to trust him. "That would be kind of you," she said finally. "I'll call for you at 4:45 then," he said, tipping his hat before striding away, his spurs jingling with each step. True to his word, Jacob was waiting outside the boarding house the next morning, a lantern in hand to light their way through the pre-dawn darkness. He made easy conversation as they walked, telling her about the town and its inhabitants without prying into her own circumstances. "Peterson's a good man," Jacob assured her as they approached the bakery where light already spilled from the windows. "Fair and honest, you'll do well here." "Thank you," Madeline said, suddenly nervous about her new position. "For everything." Jacob's expression softened in the lantern light. "You're doing just fine, Miss Adams. This town might surprise you." Working at the bakery proved to be exhausting but satisfying. Mr. Peterson was indeed fair, teaching Madeline how to knead dough and shape loaves with patience. Her days began well before dawn and often lasted until mid-afternoon, but the work was honest, and the pay, while modest, would cover her room and board. Each morning for the first week, Jacob appeared faithfully to escort her to work, and though Madeline insisted she could manage on her own, she found herself looking forward to those quiet walks through the sleeping town. "Why do they call you the Dust Devil?" she asked one morning, having overheard the nickname at the bakery. Jacob chuckled, the sound warm in the cool morning air. "I break horses for a living. Got away with the wild ones, they say. Dust flies when we're working, and I don't give up easy." "That sounds dangerous," Madeline observed. "It can be," he admitted. "But there's nothing like the feeling when a horse that once tried to kill you decides you're trustworthy enough to carry." There was something in his voice, a passion that resonated with Madeline's own buried dreams. Before Henry, before the promise of California and a proper married life, she had harbored ambitions of her own of creating beautiful garments that would make women feel confident and powerful. "I understand," she said softly. "Finding your purpose." Jacob glanced at her curiously. "And what's your purpose, Miss Adams, if you don't mind my asking?" Madeline hesitated, unused to sharing her thoughts with others. "I was a seamstress before." She trailed off, unwilling to mention Henry. "I enjoyed creating something beautiful from nothing but fabric and thread." "That's a fine skill," Jacob said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Useful out here too, not many with the talent for it." His words stayed with her throughout the day as she shaped loaves and chatted with customers. That evening, after washing the flour from her hair and hands, she sat by her window and took out the small sewing kit from her valise. Her fingers moved automatically, mending a small tear in her apron, then embellishing the edge with a delicate floral pattern. As the days passed, Madeline settled into a routine. Work at the bakery, evenings spent sewing by candlelight, and Sunday mornings at the small church where she sat quietly in the back pew, still feeling like an outsider among the congregation of families and established couples. It was after one such service, 3 weeks after her arrival in Copper Creek, that she encountered Jacob again outside the church. He was dressed in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing, and he tipped his hat to her with a smile. "Miss Adams," he greeted her, "you're looking well. Seems bakery work agrees with you." It was true that the fresh air and physical labor had brought color to her cheeks and a strength to her arms she hadn't possessed in Boston. "Mr. O'Malley," she returned with a small smile. "Thank you, I haven't seen you at the livery lately." "Been breaking horses for the Murphy Ranch," he explained. "Just got back to town yesterday." They fell into step together, walking slowly back toward the main street. "I hear there's to be a social at the schoolhouse next Saturday," Jacob said after a moment. "Music, dancing, food. The whole town turns out for it." Madeline's heart quickened, wondering if he was leading up to asking her to accompany him, but Jacob merely continued describing the event, making no such invitation. "It sounds lovely," she said when he finished. "Perhaps I'll attend." Jacob nodded, and if he was disappointed by her non-committal response, he didn't show it. "Well, I should be getting on. Got horses waiting." "Of course," Madeline replied, ignoring the slight pang of disappointment. "Good day, Mr. O'Malley." As she watched him walk away, Mrs. Whittaker appeared at her side, a knowing look on her face. "That Jacob O'Malley's been sweet on you since you arrived," the older woman commented. "Half the unmarried women in town would give their eyeteeth for his attention." Madeline felt her cheeks warm. "We're merely acquaintances, Mrs. Whittaker," the landlady snorted. "If you say so, dear. But a word of advice, men like Jacob don't stay unattached forever, too much of a catch." The idea that Jacob might be interested in her romantically was both thrilling and terrifying. After Henry's betrayal, Madeline had sworn off romantic entanglements. And yet, there was something about the quiet cowboy that made her wonder if perhaps her heart wasn't as thoroughly closed as she'd believed. The week leading up to the social was busy at the bakery, with Mr. Peterson preparing special treats for the event. Madeline worked longer hours, her fingers cramping from kneading dough and forming delicate pastries. In her scarce free time, she set about refurbishing her best dress, a pale blue creation that had once been fashionable in Boston, but now seemed overly formal for frontier life. With careful stitches, she removed the excessive trim and reshaped the bodice to a more practical cut, adding embroidered wildflowers along the hem in colors that matched the Wyoming landscape. By Saturday afternoon, she had transformed the gown into something that honored both her past and her present. Mrs. Whittaker nodded approvingly when Madeline descended the stairs that evening. "You'll turn heads tonight, Miss Adams." The schoolhouse was transformed when Madeline arrived, lanterns strung across the ceiling and tables laden with food along one wall. A small band played in the corner, and couples already twirled across the makeshift dance floor. Madeline stood uncertainly just inside the entrance, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. She spotted Mr. Peterson and his wife, and several regular customers from the bakery who nodded in recognition. But there was no sign of Jacob. "Miss Adams," a voice called, and she turned to see the schoolteacher, Miss Clark, beckoning her over. "I'm so glad you came. We've been hoping to properly welcome you to our community." Madeline joined the small group of women, accepting a cup of punch and listening as they chatted about town affairs. She was just beginning to relax when a murmur went through the crowd, and heads turned toward the door. Jacob O'Malley stood there, looking almost uncomfortable in clean denims and a pressed shirt, his hat in his hands. His eyes scanned the room until they found Madeline, and the smile that spread across his face sent warmth cascading through her. He made his way to her side, nodding politely to the other ladies. "Miss Adams, you look beautiful tonight." "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley," she replied, suddenly conscious of every breath, every movement. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, offering his hand. Madeline hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers in his calloused palm. "I would." Jacob led her to the dance floor as the band struck up a waltz. His hand was warm at her waist, respectfully placed but firm enough to guide her through the steps. "I wasn't sure you'd come tonight," Madeline admitted as they moved in time to the music. "Wouldn't have missed it," Jacob replied, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Been thinking about asking you to dance since I first saw you standing in the middle of the street." Madeline laughed softly, remembering their inauspicious first meeting. "I wasn't at my best that day." "You were plenty fine," he said seriously. "Brave, facing a new town alone." "Not brave," she corrected. Desperate, Jacob's steps slowed slightly. "What happened, Madeline?" "If you don't mind my asking." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the intimacy of it, combined with the genuine concern in his eyes, loosened the knot of secrecy she'd held tight around her heart. "I was engaged," she said quietly as they continued to dance. "Henry and I were traveling to California to be married. He changed his mind when we reached Copper Creek, said I wasn't suited for frontier life, that I was too precious, too much of a burden to take any further." The familiar burn of humiliation colored her words. "He left me here with barely enough money for a week's lodging and continued west without me." Jacob's hand tightened slightly at her waist, and a muscle ticked in his jaw. "That man's a damn fool," he said with quiet intensity. "Pardon my language." "Perhaps he was right," Madeline said, voicing the doubt that had plagued her since that day. "Perhaps I am too delicate for this life." Jacob stopped dancing altogether, drawing her slightly away from the other couples. "Is that what you believe, after everything you've accomplished here?" Madeline blinked, taken aback by his vehemence. "You arrived with nothing but determination," Jacob continued. "Found honest work, made a place for yourself, earned respect. There's nothing precious or delicate about that, Madeline. That's pure grit." His words washed over her like a cleansing rain, dissolving layers of doubt she hadn't even realized were still clinging to her. Tears pricked at her eyes, but they were tears of release rather than sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob's expression softened. "I'm just stating facts, madam." The band had moved on to another tune, but they remained standing apart from the dancers, connected by something deeper than the music. "Would you care to step outside for some air?" Jacob asked, seeming to sense her need for a moment of privacy. Madeline nodded, and he led her through the schoolhouse doors and onto the small porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. The music and laughter from inside created a comforting backdrop to the stillness of the evening. "It's beautiful here," Madeline said, looking up at the constellations. "I never saw stars like this in Boston." "One of the things I love about this country," Jacob agreed, standing beside her at the railing, "makes a man feel both significant and insignificant all at once." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, shoulders not quite touching. "That's a fine dress," Jacob commented. "Different from when I first saw you wearing it at church." Madeline glanced at him in surprise. "You noticed?" "I notice everything about you," he admitted, his voice low. Then, clearing his throat, "You changed it yourself," she nodded, running her fingers over the embroidered wildflowers. "I wanted something that belonged here, not just in Boston." "It suits you," he said. "Both places in one person." There was understanding in his words that touched Madeline deeply. Jacob saw her not as the refined Boston lady nor as the frontier woman she was becoming, but as the complex blend of both. "Jacob," she began, gathering her courage. "I've been meaning to thank you properly for your kindness when I first arrived. You were the only person who offered help when I needed it most." "Anyone would have done the same," he demurred. "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. You saw me at my lowest moment and treated me with respect." "That means a great deal to me." Jacob turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the spill of light from the schoolhouse windows. "Madeline, I need to be honest with you. My interest in your welfare wasn't entirely altruistic." Her heart quickened. "No." "No," he confirmed, taking a small step closer. "From the moment I saw you standing in that street, too proud to break despite being abandoned, I was drawn to you. Your spirit, your determination. And every day since has only strengthened that feeling." Madeline's breath caught in her throat. "Jacob, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know it's too soon after what happened with your former fiancé. I just wanted you to know where I stand." But Madeline shook her head, finding courage in his honesty. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Not when it's right." Hope kindled in Jacob's eyes. "And is it right?" In answer, Madeline closed the distance between them, placing her hand lightly on his arm. "I think it might be," she whispered. Jacob's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, seeking permission. When she nodded slightly, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch that deepened when she responded. When they finally drew apart, Madeline felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "I'm not rushing you," Jacob promised, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "We have time. It was a gift Madeline hadn't expected to receive in Copper Creek, time to discover who she truly was, time to heal. And now, time to explore the connection growing between her and this man who had seen value in her when she'd felt worthless. "I would like that," she said, smiling up at him. The sound of the schoolhouse door opening broke the moment, and they stepped slightly apart as several couples spilled onto the porch, laughing and talking. "Shall we go back inside?" Jacob asked, offering his arm. Madeline slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. "Yes, let's." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of dancing and conversation. Jacob introduced her to friends and acquaintances, his hand a reassuring presence at the small of her back. For the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, Madeline felt not like an outsider but like a woman finding her place in a community that might, in time, become home. As the social drew to a close, Jacob walked her back to the boarding house, their steps unhurried beneath the star-strewn sky. "Mr. Peterson mentioned he's thinking of expanding the bakery," Madeline said as they approached Mrs. Whittaker's door, "perhaps adding a tea room for the ladies." "That's so," Jacob replied, interest warming his voice. "And what do you think of that idea?" "I think it has merit," she said thoughtfully. "But I also had another thought. The town lacks a proper dressmaker, and I've had several women ask about my sewing after they noticed the alterations to my clothing. Jacob stopped walking, turning to face her. You're considering opening your own business. The idea had been forming in Madeline's mind for days, but speaking it aloud made it suddenly real. It's presumptuous, perhaps. I've only been here a short time. It's not presumptuous at all, Jacob countered. It's smart. The town's growing, and like you said, we don't have anyone with your skills. His immediate support bolstered her confidence. I would need to save more money first, find a suitable location. The old millinery shop on Cedar Street has been empty since Mrs. Foster moved to Denver, Jacob suggested. It's small, but it has good light and a living space above. The fact that he'd already thought of a potential location for her business touched Madeline deeply. This was a man who saw her dreams as worthy of consideration, who believed in her capabilities without qualification. Thank you, she said simply, for believing this is possible. Jacob's smile was warm in the moonlight. Madeline Adams, I believe you capable of anything you set your mind to. That's just a fact. They had reached the boarding house steps, and Madeline turned to face him, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end. I had a wonderful time tonight, she said. As did I, Jacob replied, his voice low. Might I call on you properly tomorrow, after church? I would like that very much, she answered, her heart light with possibility. Jacob took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Madeline. Good night, Jacob, she whispered, watching as he backed away, tipping his hat before turning to walk down the street. As Madeline climbed the stairs to her room, she realized that for the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, she was looking forward to tomorrow not with dread or resignation, but with genuine anticipation. 6 months later, Madeline stood in her own shop on Cedar Street, arranging a display of ready-made shirtwaists in the window. Madeline Adams, dressmaker, was painted in elegant script on the glass, and inside the walls were lined with bolts of fabric and samples of her work. The bell above the door jingled, and she turned to see Jacob entering, a smile spreading across his face as he took in the transformed space. It looks perfect, he declared, crossing to where she stood and dropping a kiss on her lips, no longer hesitant about showing his affection. Just like its owner. Flatterer, she teased, though she couldn't help the pleasure that warmed her at his words. Is everything ready for the house? They had been working together on a small homestead just outside of town, a place Jacob had staked a claim on years ago but never properly developed. Now, with Madeline's encouragement, he had built a modest but comfortable house, with a room set aside specifically for her sewing. The last of the furniture was delivered this morning, he confirmed, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Just waiting on the bride now. In 3 days, they would be married in the same church where they had first reconnected after her arrival in town. It seemed fitting that the place that had witnessed the beginning of their courtship would also witness the beginning of their marriage. I can hardly believe how much has changed, Madeline said, leaning into his embrace. A year ago, I thought being left here was the worst thing that could happen to me. And now, Jacob prompted, his arms tightening around her waist. Now I know it was the best, she said with certainty. It led me to you, to this town, to discovering who I truly am. Jacob's expression grew serious. You know, that first day when I called you precious, I meant it as a compliment, but I was wrong about you. Oh, Madeline raised an eyebrow, curious rather than offended. You're not precious in the way I thought, he clarified. You're not delicate or in need of protection. You're precious because you're rare, Madeline, strong, determined, kind. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. I thank God every day for bringing you into my life, dust and all. Madeline smiled up at the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And I thank God for a cowboy who was wise enough to recognize a good thing when he found it cast aside in the dust. As Jacob lowered his head to kiss her, Madeline closed her eyes, grateful for the journey that had brought her here to this town, this shop, this man, and most importantly, to herself. In the distance, the train whistle sounded, bringing new arrivals to Copper Creek. But unlike the frightened woman who had stood in the dust of the departing stagecoach a year ago, Madeline Adams was no longer lost or abandoned. She was home.